星空联盟成员中国核建。Just required assistance may board at any.
各位旅客，我们的飞机马上就要起飞了，请您再次确认您的安全带已扣好系紧，手机处于关闭状态或调至飞行模式，谢谢。Your passengers on plane will be take off soon. Please make sure that your seat belt is securely fastened and your mobile phone remains switched off or set to airplane mode. Thank you.